Hi, folks. Sorry again, we think we have solved the technical big bugs. So let's jump in so that we don't get lost again. Really delighted to be joined by Professor Henry Farrell at GWU, who produced, with his co-author Abraham Newman, a really phenomenal book of Privacy and Power. Thanks to all of you on the book club who recommended it. There were a lot of hot privacy books out this past couple of months. Brad Smith's book, a number of other books, and this was the top vote getter. So I'm glad that it popped to the top of our list. Marianne here to my right, who you may be able to see, our communications lead, is helping coordinate and will be trying to help those of you who are remote who may want to ask questions, come on in. Thank you for joining us remote. Caitlin Toby. Caitlin's a paralegal and compliance specialist from Boston and one of our book club members who enjoyed the book and is going to help join us in kicking off the conversation. Jeremy Greenberg, one of our policy fellows who read along with us. Our new European director, Rob Van Eyck. Rob was at the Dutch Data Protection Authority and so lived through on the European side a number of the episodes that are well described in this book. And finally, Professor Farrell. So for those of us who live the ups and downs of Snowden and Privacy Shield and Safe Harbor, this was a gripping drama, frankly, and I think you really did a nice job capturing a lot of the back and forths. But how did you come to this? You aren't, one of the sort of full-time privacy-focused academics. You come to this from the international affairs science of things. And so what was most interesting for those of us who spend lots of time talking to privacy researchers and privacy academics and kind of the worldview and the structures that we think about things, seeing how somebody who studies and thinks about the academic underpinnings of international relations really added a valuable element. But what convinced you that this particular part of the world, privacy, data protection, was worthy of your attention? How did you get hooked on this?
Well, it's a bit depressing in some way to say that the truth is that I started to get interested in stuff right at the end of the 1990s, the beginning of the 2000s. I was looking around. I was doing a postdoc in Germany at a Max Planck Institute, and I was looking for a topic that would be interesting on international politics, on e-commerce, ideally, and also that would ideally get me back and forth to Washington, D.C. My spouse is a lawyer, and I wanted an excuse to come visit as often as possible. So this was a long, long time ago that I started to get interested in this. And also I met the person who was to be my co-author, Abe Newman, who was, at that stage, a young scholar, still had not finished his PhD, and was looking at the European Union's role as a protector of privacy. And so we started to get interested in this topic. And as you say, to start thinking about it from the perspective of international regulation and international politics. And then in about 2008, 2009, we decided that we were going to write a book, and that this would be a book that we thought was going to be interesting, but that we probably thought at that stage would have maybe 300 or 400 readers in the world, and that would be it. And then, of course, we keep on plugging away, and then Snowden happens, then Schrems happens, then all of these things happen, which turned this from what would have been, I think, a pretty standard political science book into something that isn't quite a thrill, a moment, exciting paperback bestseller that you pick up in the airport. We don't have all that much in the way of car crashes or exciting airplanes and sort of exploding into mountains or what have you, but nonetheless where there's a real and an important story, and a story that has changed the world. So in a sense what we've done is we have some political science in there because we are political scientists, but we also provide a roadmap for people who aren't so interested in what political scientists like to talk about, so that they can then see how the story developed and how it is that we get these different episodes culminating in a profoundly changed privacy landscape now in the last few years from what anybody would have expected to have been likely 6 or 7 years back.
It's interesting because it didn't feel like a very heavy academic tome. It's obviously very accessible, but books in this vein seem to either be really academic and not accessible to a wide audience, or written for that sort of wider audience and not as respected or valued in the academic community. Is this sort of a hybrid? Do you get the appropriate academic value? We're always, we want academics spending more time on the issues we in privacy care about, but we're aware often that succeeding in tenure and the appropriate things that the academic community gives credit for are not necessarily the kinds of things, this is really interesting and matters for policy, matters for, general readership. So is this sort of a hybrid?
So there are a couple of things going on. First of all, the good news for me is that it's a long while since I got tenure. I guess also the bad news for me is that it's a long time since I got tenure. So I don't really have to worry about that kind of thing anymore. You have enormous freedom once you get tenure to do whatever the hell you want, and I have taken great advantage of that liberty. But what I would say is that, as you say, this is not a book which is written from within the privacy community. So I think that the trade-offs of writing are a little bit different than they would be for somebody who's, say, for example, looking at this saying, I have a ton of expert knowledge because I have been working in the privacy arena for 20 years, and then you decide, do you write for your fellow privacy professionals, or do you write for a broader public? So what we are doing, in a sense, is we are writing for academics, but academics who, by and large, are not going to have read much about privacy before that. And so what we have to do is we have to, in a sense, we have to sell privacy to them as an important topic, as a topic where there is an interesting story to be told. So I think that's how we manage to do that in a readable way. And also I do a lot of writing. I write a lot for foreign affairs, foreign policy, the usual New York Times type places where you do op-eds or you do longer think pieces. And I presume some of that helps to rub off to some degree on our writing, the fact that we have a lot of experience in writing for a broader public, so that we aren't necessarily going to get stuck into the extremely abstract kind of language that academics often use unless we feel that is absolutely necessary. And even then, as I say, we provide guide rails so that you can sort of work your way around the unfortunate sort of holes in the narrative and sort of get very quickly back to the plot line if that is what you're interested in finding out about.
And is this topic, are there others in the international affairs academic community that are, now that these issues are not just niche issues of obscure things like Privacy Shield to the general audience, but now that it's about digital platforms and European sovereignty around data, has this is that still too pop culture, or has this is this already an issue of interest in the broader international community that obviously is interested in power dynamics?
Well, I think people are interested in it, but what I would say in general about international relations scholars is that we're really good at predicting the future as long as the future is 6 years in the past. And there's a particular reason for that kind of time lag, which is that is the time that it takes some bright, bushy-tailed young person. She sees that there's something interesting happening, and she wants to write her dissertation on the topic, and then she writes her dissertation, and then she takes another couple of years to start publishing. So by and large, we are, for the reasons that you mentioned earlier, tenure, all of these requirements to publish stuff in peer-reviewed journals, we tend not to be a very, very timely field in jumping on top of this stuff. So I would say in general, if we're to move beyond privacy to the other issues that you're talking about, such as information platforms and so on, there are a number of very interesting scholars who are working in the same kind of vein as Abe and I, but I think that it would be fair to say that we tend in general to be kind of frustrated by the lack of the lack of ability to really break this out to the broader community. For example, people who study political economy, they tend to be really interested in trade, they tend to be really interested in finance, they tend not to have had much of an idea up until very recently that information is a crucial role of the global, crucial part of the global political economy as well. And we are now at the stage where I think people are beginning to wake up to this and get excited about it, but where we do not have the body of really smart, bright young people brighter and younger than I am, who are really sort of pushing this forward. I think that's going to happen over the next couple of years, but I think we're not there yet.
One last question for me, and then Caitlin, I'm going to turn to you for your reaction, any thoughts or comments on the book, or any questions, and then our colleagues here in the room. Anything that, I assume you had some learning curve here in terms of, tracking the ins and outs of data protection law and how the actors were playing this out. Anything that sort of took you in an unusual direction or surprised you as you kind of came in from the outside to
well,
look
I
at
think
this world?
the moment when the book came together, when we figured out what our theme was, which I think was a little surprising, but I think is also right, is that we began to realize that this was not a Europe versus US thing in the way that people tend to think that it is. You know, so people tend to have these very standard tropes or images that they fall into, that this is about civil liberties protecting Europe versus the tough martial United States, the kind of the Robert Kagan, Mars versus Venus stuff. And you can certainly explain significant chunks of the story if you wanted to take that on. You know, so there certainly is a greater sense in Europe of data protection and of thinking about, you know, all of these things as human rights than there is in the United States. The regimes are very different. But if you want to look at the actual politics, it is much more than anything else. It is about cross-national coalitions, transatlantic coalitions, and in particular this transatlantic security coalition, which, as we document, manages to really dominate the debate from a period after September 11th, 2001, for several years after that, and really manages to have a fair amount of free leeway in order to shape this new way of doing things internationally. And then, of course, we get the revenge of the other side in the post-Snowden era, where we get, you know, Snowden is important. I think that in some ways Schrems is maybe even more important as the strategic and astute actor who figures out that the Snowden revelations offer a way to try and join together these issues that have not previously been joined and use the safe harbor as a means to try and blow up the system that he intensely dislikes, and in a sense will have huge consequences for the United States as well as a result of his effort to protect what he sees as being being specifically European laws, European practices against this platform economy, which he is very, very strongly opposed to. So I think that the key thing that, if there's one lesson that I think I would like people to take away from our book, it's that it's useful to think about Europe versus the United States, but it gets to be kind of glib, and it also tends to really conceal a lot of the very important debates and a lot of the important coalitions, which more and more, I think, involve people from both sides of the Atlantic identifying together around shared interests, shared ethical beliefs, shared whatevers, and then trying to see how it is that this complex transatlantic system can be leveraged in ways that allow them to push their particular agenda.
Well, as one of those transnational actors, I think that you described, I can tell you, you quite accurately did capture what to us is that battlefield dynamic. It clearly is a world of civil liberties groups here who also have a range of differences,
yeah,
frankly, in their perspectives, and the different government actors in Congress, and obviously the many different stakeholders on the European side. So it read quite true, which is, I think, a great compliment. Caitlin, thoughts, reaction?
So we actually unfortunately lost Caitlin, but I do have a question from Michelle Bay, so I'm going to promote her to panelist so she can ask the question directly. All right, so she just needs to rejoin as a panelist. There she is, and I'm going to unmute her. Okay.
Hi, Jules. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Michelle.
Hi. Thanks for mentioning the Schrems 2 case. I have a question about that to the panelists and also the author. So the counsel acting for Schrem in the case argued that he questions about whether there's adequate data protection in the privacy shield, and I'd be really interested in learning about what your thoughts are on his arguments.
Well, let me give you an answer which may not be, this is more of a political science type answer than it is a legal analysis answer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm married to a lawyer, and I guess, yes, you absorb some stuff by osmosis, but not nearly enough to pretend to be an expert. if I were to think about what's happening with Schrems 2 and so on, I would see, I would really be interested in the political aspects and angle to this. And in particular, I think that the role that the Schrems line of cases and other cases that are similar have played in providing the European Court of Justice with a means to expand its authority over a variety of issue areas where its authority might have been considered to be somewhat shaky. And I feel that a lot of this also has to do with the relationship between the European Court of Justice and what is happening in Karlsruhe. So you've got you've got this continuing simmering tension between the German Constitutional Court and the European Court of Justice. And one of the things that privacy and data protection offers for the ECJ is the opportunity to really take a central role on something that is probably not going to get as much pushback from German justices because they recognize the need to do this stuff. So I think that one of the stories which has been, I think, less recognized or less analyzed, certainly in the US debate, is the way in which this, a lot of this has to do with judicial politics within the European Union and with the efforts of the European Court of Justice to establish a line of jurisprudence that effectively, sort of does what courts like to do, which is to expand their authority and to set them as as central players, central actors in this expanding environment. Now, of course, the problem is that nobody has any idea of what this landscape is going to look like in the longer run. What we can say is that the current system is not particularly workable, that there are just too many opportunities for unexpected things to happen with data protection authorities. There's too much messiness in the relationship between the data protection authorities and the European Court of Justice under the initial Schrems decision. So there is going to be a lot of very, very messy and turbulent politics, one imagines, over the next number of years, as we see, for example, that thing a few months ago where the Data Protection Authority in Hesse gave that ruling about Microsoft, so where we see all of these individual level actions being taken, sometimes with dramatic larger scale consequences. And as a political scientist, I tend to look to these things not in terms of the underlying legal principles that are at stake, but much more in terms of who are the actors, what are their powers, what are their motivations, and by and large actors, especially regulatory actors, like to have more power, more resources, more goodies rather than less, and how much that shapes the arena. So that's probably not a very specifically useful answer to your question, but that's, I guess, at least the way that I think about these things.
For those who haven't watched the video of the Chief Justice of the Court talking about the privacy jurisprudence of the court and the court's direction, it's actually on YouTube now. Take a look at the speech that the Chief Justice gave at the International Conference of Data Protection and Privacy Commissioners last year in Brussels. We'll see if we can, we'll send out the link to the group afterwards. If you haven't watched it, it's critical because you can see how the court is eager to build on this philosophy that they have been putting in place. And indeed, the future of European data protection is increasingly in the hands of the court, whether it's cookies, whether it's the privacy shield, whether it's so many of the other questions. Thank you, Michelle. So, Rob, you were on the European side, even on the regulatory side, participating in Article 29 efforts and the Dutch DPA efforts and so forth. How did this read to you? This is an American scholar writing from one particular vantage point of scholarship. How did it resonate? Did this accurately describe the view from where you were sitting?
Well, I have to congratulate you with the book, and specifically with the clear timeline that is also part of Chapter 3. I joined almost a decade ago, which is the beginning, early 2010.
Yeah.
This Google Street View was one of my first projects I was participating. And being a relatively junior employee at that time at the DPA, I had the feeling I was looking through a keyhole all the time. And reading this book, it was very interesting because I started to piece together the bigger picture. So So I would congratulate you to being able to get away from looking through the keyholes, because you can look through many keyholes, and then being able to describe to us a very nice overall picture. And so I have like more a follow-up question to that. And of course, a lot of things happen throughout these 10 years, and you choose to focus in your search to look who the actors are, what the powers are, and their motivations. You choose specifically the context of passenger name records, SWIFT, and now, of course, the cross-border protections with the PCR, Schrems, Privacy Shield. There may have been possibly other topics. I would be interested to hear, have you considered such? And if so, what could be possible candidates for future additional chapters?
That's an excellent question, and a question that I am not nearly as prepared for as I would like, because you're absolutely right. In a certain sense, we are not only political scientists, but we're amateur historians, and the cases that you choose to study are obviously, so they obviously shape what it is that what is the story that you tell. And more or less what we wanted to do was to try and figure out, and also I have to say we were writing this on the fly. So this, as I say, has been a book we've been writing more or less during the period of your career in privacy, and so we changed the structure of the book a lot as we went. What I would say is that there were other issues that we certainly thought about sort of as we were going along. The things like Google make it in passing. The other thing that is not a big part of our story, although Abe has done separate work on this with one of his graduate students, is GDPR. And that, of course, is the crucial big part of our story, which we thought about trying to get in somehow, but then we decided that there clearly are transatlantic elements to this. And one of the things that Abe does very nicely in this other article is to look at how the Snowden revelations really managed to change the debate in the European Parliament, and also change the final text so that it suddenly became a lot more difficult for industry to get its way than it had been in the past. Once these were issues that had a public valence, and once there was controversy surrounding it. But we decided that in the end that this was going to be extraordinarily important for privacy, but that if we really wanted to do this, we would probably have to spend another 2 or 3 years waiting for the GDPR thing to start working its way through in terms of understanding what the consequences were, what all of the things that are left messy and ambiguous in GDPR, how they were worked out. And we wanted to get the damn book written already, and so hence we decided not to do that. So I think GDPR would be one of the key things that we would have liked to have done more on. And the other thing that is also, I think, very interesting and very important, if we were to write a continuation of the book today, which I don't think we're going to do because we have only limited time, the electronic evidence and the Cloud Act stuff, I think that is the new major area that hits the sweet spot of the kinds of stuff that we're trying to talk about, which is really looking at the relationship between security and privacy. Data is key and crucial. We also, I think, it would have been fun to have looked at some of the more technical issues and looked, for example, at debates around crypto. That is another very important debate, which we thought about, we were interested in, but it is just too hard to put into the kind of narrative that we are putting together. And so the 3 cases that we chose seemed to us to be the 3 cases that really, I guess, illustrated the mechanisms that we were interested in, the power relationships between these 2 different transatlantic coalitions the best.
Increasingly, again, some of the most insightful work around privacy is work done by people in other disciplines, behavioral economists, UI designers, researchers in other areas who force us to get out of our very narrow space. Let me go to our friend John Croft, longtime privacy leader in the area. Are we going to bring John via video? We're going to
bring him in as a panelist. I just need him to confirm if that's okay with him, since we'd be using his voice and/or image.
All right, I'm going to read. John, hi there. I'm going to read your question, assuming that your corporate firewall, it may not be easy to bring you in, but If we can, we will, because John's an author and scholar. So John says, the EU and US seem to be able to come to agreement on other international standards in the area of commerce, like customs, taxes, financial services, and others. Any views on why there seem to be such challenges in the area of data privacy? I guess I'll add on to the question. Is it indeed true? We work in privacy, so we think it seems to be impossible to get some agreement. Is this an area where the cultural gaps are bigger? And John points to other places where we do seem to negotiate, or frankly, are we just not sitting in those rooms where people there are kind of yelling and screaming, and it's actually taking years? Is this a particularly challenging area?
I think that's right. I think that it is a much more difficult area than other areas, because if you look at standard negotiations, typically negotiations take place in a space where there are winners and losers, but where there is some deal to be reached, which is an obvious midway point between the two. Privacy is not like this. So as I say, I've been doing this for a long time, and I can remember talking to Ambassador David Aaron and his counterparts on the European side, Sue Binns and other people who were working then in the Commission's internal market, and the broad sense that they provided was that they did not think that safe harbor was going to happen. So they effectively saw these two, this irresistible force and an immovable object, that the European side and the United States side just were too far apart in basic values for any kind of real arrangement to be reached. And so they were more or less sort of trying to dance around, trying to figure out, is there some way that we can soften or mitigate the impact at least? And then Aaron comes up with this complicated mixture of private authority and public authority, which is safe harbor, which gives both sides something that they had not expected. And I think the general problem with all of this is that if you're thinking about, for example, financial standards, you're going to have sharply divergent interests on both sides of the Atlantic. Perhaps say it's accountancy standards. One side of the Atlantic wants this, the other side of the Atlantic wants that. But they also see that there are benefits to convergence. There is a solution which will provide everybody with benefits, and the only question is which solution is chosen, and they disagree about which solution is chosen, but they both have an interest in some solution being chosen because they are stuck together. When it comes to things like privacy, it isn't anywhere near as obvious. You have people with very, very deeply committed and sincere beliefs. And when this comes together with security, where you equally have people who have sincere beliefs that they want to protect citizens against various threats, and that they are being hampered in this by these privacy rules that they regard as being antiquated and problematic, it's very, very hard to reach solutions. So I think that this is inevitably going to be a much more contested area than many other areas. And the more that we see jurisdictions begin to overlap and intermingle with each other, so that what happens in the European Union has great consequences for the United States and vice versa, the more we're going to see these kinds of conflicts arise, because it really is people seeing stuff that they do not like happening on their home territory. And that, again, is a Schrems story. So Max is very clear about this, that he isn't particularly bothered or concerned about what the U.S. does within the U.S. So he is concerned about this because he sees this as being a threat from abroad to values that he sees as being fundamental to his understanding of the European way of life.
So you now are losing your exalted status as the author being interviewed, because we try to keep this as a book club.
Excellent.
When the author is remote, we sometimes kick them out, or we say, stick around, because we're happy to have your comment. But we're gonna talk, and you're welcome to, like any other book club member, speak up and disagree, or ask us for another cup of coffee or the like. So
we also actually have a comment from Gabriella in response to your answer.
All right.
So I brought her in as a panelist.
Great. So I'm going to go to Gabriella Zanfer-Fortuna, another European expert, or at least the work of the European Data Protection Supervisor, works for FPF in Detroit. Peter Kosmala, we're going to jump to you afterwards, so stand by. We're going to bring Peter in on video as well. Okay. And then Jeremy's going to jump in as well. So Gabriella. Hi.
Well, hello everyone, and thank you for this very interesting discussion for a Wednesday afternoon. This is fantastic. I just wanted to jump in and say a couple of words about the differences between the American and the European privacy philosophy, if you want. As it happens, very recently, I've been doing some research on the history of how all this privacy law, well, data protection law started in the 70s. And I have to say that I found some very compelling common ground between the European and the American way of looking at massive collection and processing of personal data by automated systems. And if we look at the Hugh report from the 70s on fair information practices, and if we look at what was going on in the 70s in Europe with the Younger Committee in the UK and some other specialized committees of the parliaments that were looking at these issues back then in Western Europe, we find so many points of convergence that it's really outstanding. So I would say that while there are certainly big cultural differences, especially right now, on how we look at privacy in the US and then how we look at privacy in Europe, we can find that point of convergence, particularly if we distinguish between privacy as protecting the private sphere and data protection as ensuring that any use of personal data is fair towards the individual and perhaps fair towards the society. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation.
We, a couple of months ago, read Professor Sarah Ego's book, The History of Privacy in the US, if I have the title right. And it was really magnificent to see how, you know, over 100 years, there have been really intense cultural and legal battles around privacy in the US that show that the history is quite richer, even if we maybe took some legal detours in the past 20 years. So thanks for that point, Gabriela. Peter Kosmala. Peter, you're north of Boston, right? Are you in Maine? Do we have Peter?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can. Hi, Peter.
Yeah, well, thank you. And thank you, Jules, for hosting this, another great book club discussion. And thank you, Mr. Farrell, for your remarks today. I'm especially encouraged by your book, which I think is taking a much broader perspective on this issue by bringing, you know, elements of politics and socioeconomic considerations into it, which I'm a huge fan of, because I think that's really the only way to really get to the crux of the issue, is to elevate it to that height. And in that vein, I had a question for you, Mr. Farrell, which is, given the historical origins of the European data protection approach itself, which, as you know, is largely defined and informed by decades of information abuses, primarily by, you know, oppressive regimes in Eastern Europe, you know, dictatorial regimes, you know, information abuses where information was used against the citizenry, whether that was, you know, labor union membership or political affiliation, or any number of other personal attributes that was actively used against citizens, whereby they were imprisoned, they were tortured, you know, a lot of really bad stuff, honestly. And clearly the Europeans reflected on that, and they made that really of the, you know, the Human Rights Charter, the very concept of privacy as a fundamental human right. And that became the essential architecture of the directive, and we see that reinforced even more rigorously in the GDPR today. That's all accepted and well understood. My question is, how, you know, what is the efficacy of taking an approach like that is very rooted in a discrete social and cultural and political tradition, and expecting that it will simply work elsewhere in countries outside of the EU, which frankly do not have that social history? Some may. I mean, I'm not going to say that the United States is a squeaky clean in its history of information or counterintelligence against its own citizens, nor Canada, nor Mexico. You know, certainly there's Latin American regimes where this was the case. But, you know, at its essence, what are your thoughts on, you know, the likelihood, the efficacy of taking that approach where, you know, laws such as the CCPA in California, which to a large extent emulates the GDPR and even goes beyond it, will that work? Is it built on an assumption that is perhaps well-intentioned, but ill-informed, because it's making some very broad assumptions on how the culture views business, society, the economy in ways that are very specific to its history. And that's not to suggest that we're erecting borders deliberately on this notion. It's just a recognition of what is nationally authentic in a privacy protection approach.
Can I take those two questions together? Because I think that they point in interestingly different directions. So the first question really points at the ways in which this is part of a common movement. If you're to look at the principles of the European Directive, they really stem from these principles that have been developed transatlantically over a period before that. So here, the book that I think about sometimes here is Colin Campbell's book, which more or less develops this and uses his book doesn't have nearly the same degree of conflict as the book that Abe and I described, because this is at a period where, as the first question developed, there is in fact a relative degree of unanimity around the broad principles that ought to be applied. And so you see in many ways the 1974 Privacy Act in the United States and the Data Protection Directive, they are very clearly descendants of the same intellectual movement. And you also see a lot of this happening at the international level as well, so that the OECD has these privacy principles, which are, again, very recognizably related to both. So I think that if you're to look at where the European debate comes from, clearly there is a far stronger sense in Europe about the importance of privacy and of individual privacy on certain kinds of questions than there is in the United States. But I think that the actual rules and laws they descend from this much more international debate. And when you see the origins of the directive within the European Union, this is also, from the perspective of the European Commission, they are not really interested at that stage in the deep fundamental privacy rights that are involved. They are dealing with a very practical problem, which is that some states in the European Union have strong privacy laws, other states do not, and this is interfering with the kinds of things that the European Union actually cares about, which is commerce and the single market. And so this is why it is that for a very long period of time, privacy as an issue, data protection is lodged within DG Internal Market, within the European Commission, because from the European Commission's perspective, they are trying to deal with these pain in the ass data protection commissioners who keep on saying you cannot transport data from one country to another, and this is impeding the creation of the single market. So you get data protection commissioners, and this is all I'm stealing blatantly from my co-author Abe Newman's first book is all about how this happens. You get the European Commission effectively being blackmailed by some national data protection commissioners into coming up with a set of rules on the European Union level, which will create a level playing field. The European Commission wants a level playing field. They want this to be relatively strong rules, and they compromise around these broadly accepted privacy principles, which have an international element to them. So when I look at the actual rules, the rules, they're not that different in many of their, in the way that they are framed, in the ultimate goals that they're trying to achieve, from the same kinds of rules that you see in the Privacy Act and in other transnational or international manifestations of it. Where they do differ is in the comprehensiveness of it. They differ in the implementation. They differ especially in the aspects that pertain to the private sector. But again, I think that we tend to overestimate the extent to which this is European values versus American values. Instead, you get much messier political relations, and also a lot of people within the European Union who aren't particularly enthused about privacy values either, especially when they interfere with the fight against terrorism. So I guess, this is the argument that we make in the book, is that it's not nearly so much about this clash of values as the standard story says. This is much more about a messy, confusing situation in which you have different actors on both sides of the Atlantic who are opposed or in favor of these particular kinds of rules working, and to strike alliances with each other in a more or less opportunistic fashion across the Atlantic in order to try and get their way and to try to do down the other guy.
And thanks, Peter. And as the conclusion of the book sort of brings in, the power dynamic of digital economies and European sovereignty over data or leadership, which obviously starts bringing in those, market factors again, may end up being the most significant battle going forward. And clearly the current leadership of the European Union and the Commission and the President have all set this priority out. And so when the actors at that level, country, digital leadership and power start to, and then obviously the civil rights movement becomes involved because of concerns around discrimination, what might have been insider, diplomacy ends up being perhaps overshadowed by the titans making big decisions and antitrust law. Let me bring in Jeremy, who I know enjoyed the book. Your thoughts, your reaction?
Yeah. Thank you for having me. And Professor Farrell, thanks again for writing a fantastic book. I echo Rob's appreciation, especially of the timeline. I'm relatively new to this profession, to this practice, so I really appreciated the timeline. Hopefully I'm not dating too many folks on this call, but I certainly wasn't paying attention to these issues pre-9/11 in the 90s. I was alive, I was very young, so this is definitely a section of the book that I could see myself going back to just when I need to understand something in terms of context. So I found that to be particularly valuable. And as a practitioner in this area, as someone working in policy, I'm already thinking about how can I take the philosophy described in this book and the political theory, interdependence, and work with stakeholders from the US, from abroad, from the EU, in trying to find sort of commonalities when working on issues such as Privacy Shield, for example. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions as a way in which I could sort of start these conversations when I'm bringing together these stakeholders, in trying to find sort of a way that we can navigate these differences, maybe emphasize these common goals.
Well, I would say, among other things, we are not policy practitioners, which is both a strength and a weakness. I think the strengths that it gives us is that most people who are in this debate, they have a pretty strong standpoint on one side or another. We do have our own personal views, which we talk about a little bit towards the end, but we have been observers of this battle rather than participants within it in a variety of ways. And that's, as a political scientist, your expertise is not the expertise that is directly useful. If you're a lawyer working on privacy, you both have a deep and intimate understanding, but also you are probably going to be a player in the game in some ways. If you're a political scientist, you can step back to some degree. I guess the only thing that I would say is, again, the more that you can look at the relationships between the jurisdictions rather than one jurisdiction as against the other, the better I think you're going to be able to capture the dynamics that we're going to see going forward. So Abe and I have a piece which came out, I think, in the Financial Times, maybe in April or so, where we try to capture this in terms of the way that Facebook is responding to both the opportunities and the challenges that it faces, and saying that we really are seeing this new world emerge, which is it's a storm of possibilities. So that is, we had this system which was a messy system, but where everybody understood more or less what the rules were for a long period of time. Now we see different forms of uncertainty piled upon each other. So we see, first of all, the uncertainty of the of what's going to happen to Privacy Shield. And the sense that I get, I don't know if that's changed in the last few months, is that everybody is waiting. This is kind of like you're waiting around the old family member who is gasping their last, and you are all thinking about who gets what in the will and what's going to happen when the new dispensation emerges. How is this going to change the family dynamic, and who is the new matriarch or patriarch who is going to emerge in the stead. So we have that set of uncertainties. We have all of the uncertainties around GDPR, which is, people talk about GDPR like it is this incredibly dense and obvious text which says you do this and you do that and you do that, and some parts of it are incredibly prescriptive, but there's also a lot of stuff which reflects the fact that it's a political document and nobody knows exactly what the hell is going to happen. the actual competences of the DPAs, they're going to be worked out in part thanks to GDPR, also in part due to the politics as they try stuff and either find that it works or find that they are pushed back. So we are in this world of incredible uncertainty, and I would say that to try to talk to people, the one thing that I would stress is that they ought to think about this in terms of not only the risks, but the possibilities to shape. That this is an opportunity over the next few years where it will be possible for actors on both sides of the Atlantic to really try to push and press and shape the debate. Things are open-ended in a way that they have not been since I think the late 1990s, early 2000s.
Let me go to Rob. Let me just throw out to the audience, if you've got any sort of last comments or thoughts as we approach the top of the hour. It doesn't have to be a question, just a reaction to share with folks either online in chat room or that we can mention. We'll just toss it out. So any particular thoughts, shout outs, criticisms, please comment. Rob, you were
saying something? I have a follow-up question on this, and this is, let us zoom a little bit more on the role of the DPAs, given the fact that the civil activists have been empowered and somehow circumventing the opinions and rulings of DPAs and seek for legal certainty through the ECJ rulings and jurisprudence. So the question basically becomes, what is the value of the guidance provided by DPAs, how a GDPR principle should be interpreted, for instance, how legitimate interests should be interpreted. There are a lot of updates on guidelines and opinions that have been given by DPAs in the past. Is there any added value of DPAs, given the fact that we do see a lot of pushback, and which is actually part of your chapter, and in the last chapter, which really is different than in the PNR and SWIFT case?
So I think that there is a lot of value, and one of the questions that I have, which I genuinely don't know, and I would love to hear more about from people who are tracking this at the moment, is I think that when the DPAs act together as a force, they can be extraordinarily influential. What we are seeing at the moment is a situation in which they have some incentives to act together, but also incentives to go in different directions, and where there are some DPAs who are relatively radical on some of these questions, and some DPAs who are more just trying to figure out how can we keep things on an even keel. So my sense is, for example, if you think about the role of the European Court of Justice, as I say, courts are political actors. And I think that if they find themselves in a situation where the court is pushing back against the expert opinions of the DPAs as a collectivity, I think that's something that the court would be extremely reluctant to do. So I think that DPAs have a lot of political power when they act in a collective sense. Individual DPAs also have the ability, as we have seen, to push the envelope, to issue rulings, which apply, and all of this complicated and messy, and as far as I can see, still not particularly well-resolved set of questions about how DPAs ought to work together in circumstances where they have shared, some degree of shared jurisdiction. This is clearly a big problem. So Germany has been particularly concerned about this for a while, and there was a solution that was supposedly reached in the GDPR. How that solution is going to work in the long run, you are probably far more expert in that than I am, but I just don't have, again, it's a very, very political set of questions. So I think that the key question for DPAs is that much of their standard role of providing assurance in a system where everybody has a rough sense of the rules, that's not what we're going to be seeing over the next few years. And this means that guidances are not going to have the same kind of force and assumed authority that they had in the past. But also if DPAs want to get together and also use individual guidances as political means of pushing the debate in one way or another, the very fact that this is uncertain means that on the one hand the guidances are less likely to be binding, also means that they are more likely to be usable as ways of shaping the political background, the political environment. And the final question, of course, is to what extent do DPAs want to join together? To what extent do they want to, sometimes tacitly, sometimes more explicitly, push against each other? What are the dynamics there? And equally importantly, if they do come together, what are the positions that they gravitate around, and who decides which positions those are? So those are for me the interesting political fault lines as I see it at the moment.
We're out of time. I want to give a closing note. I don't think we have time to answer the question, but I want to put it out as food for thought from our friend Anthony, who says, do you think the way you describe commonalities between Europe and the US goes against Whitman's thesis of two Western cultures of privacy, dignity versus liberty, or is this just a different facet? I'm going to leave that perhaps for us to ponder and a thoughtful thought, because I don't think we have time to respond. Let me just thank all of you who've joined, Marianne for helping run the show, and Mary, and our team here, and of course for the book of Privacy and Power. We'll send perhaps the Financial Times piece that you mentioned. We'll ask you for
and I should also note, I think that piece is authored by me, but that is because the Financial Times does not allow dual author pieces, so it is actually authored by both of us, and Dave got his sole Financial Times piece a few weeks ago in Revenge, so yeah.
Okay, we'll share that as well as the link to the YouTube video of the court speech. So thanks everybody for joining us, and look forward to having you for our next books. Please feel free to email or suggest any books, but we'll throw out a bunch of the ones that we think are of greatest interest. Thanks everybody. Great.
I hope that